Hey there, this is your friend Charlie Hunter, and it's the Reasonably Fine Art Talk. And oh my Lord, ladies and gentlemen, oh my Lord, we have the best guest today. We have Mitch Albala, who has just published this new book, The Landscape Painter's Workbook. And it, to me, it encapsulates everything that I would love to get across to my students when I do workshops, and I become a tongue-tied mess when I'm trying to teach. This book explains everything. It just blows me away how comprehensive it is. And it uses one of my paintings as an example. And guess what? Not of great color, but of what you can do monochromatically, which seems fair enough. Before we get going, though, I did want to say we have the copy of Richard Schmidt's Alla Prima 2, which has been with our friend Kay Sneva for about the last month and a half. Well, it's time for it to move on. It will be moving on to Sandy Bogstad up in Canada. And Kay, I will get you and Sandy in touch with one another, and we'll take it from there. Just remember, everybody, when you get Alla Prima 2, you have to agree. You have to agree both to inscribe it before you pass it on to the next person, and you have to agree to do the color charts. And I'm sure Mitch would agree with me that that is a fair price to pay for a fount of knowledge like that. Anyway, I'd like to introduce a fantastic painter and a great teacher, Mr. Mitch Albala. Welcome, Mitch.
Thanks for having me, Charlie. Good to be here.
It's a joy. So you're up in Seattle right now.
I'm in Seattle.
And what you been doing today?
Today, just getting ready for our talk, and still a lot of book promotion / PR stuff that I'm tending to,
right.
Even though the book officially came out 1 week ago.
Well, I would think you'd just be getting going on flogging it. You know, you got to.
Yeah, well, we're doing things like this, but I have to reach out to all the contributors and make sure they got their copy of the book, and starting to post reviews and things like that.
Absolutely. So, but before we talk about the book, and we will be talking about the book quite a bit, I wanted to introduce you to our audience, or our audience to you. Tell us a little bit about what your calling was to become a painter, and how this has impelled you throughout your life.
Okay, big question. Well, like probably most painters, like you or anybody, it's been there my whole life. I studied art in college, and I had some really good teachers. I think I was very fortunate in that the thing that is like, say, the hallmark of my work, which is sort of this atmosphere, abstract thing, that was there very early on. And I had teachers that allowed me to do that and encouraged me to do that. So, of course, if you looked at my college paintings, you wouldn't think they look like the paintings do today. But the seeds of that abstraction and atmosphere were there. So I think that in a way, that's one of the best things I have going for me, is that I didn't have to spend 2 decades finding out, what I was interested in. And it was always there. And I think that's because who we are as painters, like our personalities, it's just in there. So after college, I didn't just, obviously start showing in galleries. I did other things in the graphics field. And slowly...
You were a technical illustrator?
I did some technical illustration back in the 80s. If you go back to it, 1986 edition of Popular Science, you might find one of my illustrations in there. So that kind of thing. It's hard to believe now, looking at my airy atmospheric paintings, that I was sitting there with a rapidograph pen doing technical illustrations before the computer.
Right.
But yeah, I did. And then over the years, primarily when I came to Seattle, I started teaching more. I got affiliated with Gage Academy, started showing more, and then some years later, well, this is going back 12 years now, there was the first book. And, it just slowly built. I think sometimes people have the idea that, young painters have the idea that, oh yeah, I'll study art and then I'll come out and I'll hang a shingle and I'll be an artist. And it's like, well, maybe, but that's not generally the course that most painters take. It takes quite a few years to find your stride and to kind of build up your reputation and get where you want to go. Of course, today we have a lot of additional tools that we didn't have 30 years ago, like the internet and social media and computers and websites, and all those things can really help us, promote ourselves.
Right. Now, during the pandemic, have you been working mostly on the book, but also
Yeah, the start of the pandemic and the contract for the book were almost synchronous. And so pretty much through the first year of the pandemic, 3/4 of that year, I was writing away, and doing art and contacting artists. And then the book was delivered about a year ago, which doesn't mean it's done. It means then I had to start working with the editors and the designers and who did a fabulous job. And it started to come together. It's just like there's a ton of stuff that had to be done. So really, in a way, the book kind of kept me sane during the pandemic. And I also was teaching some online workshops, which I find to be quite an interesting, different experience than doing them in person. I like them both, but there are some real core advantages to doing workshops online. Like, you can watch the video afterwards. I can bring pictures up on my screen and everyone will see it. Nobody's crowding around. There's a lot of really cool things about teaching online. And so I did that throughout the year and a half that I was working on the book as well.
So teaching is really fundamental to your practice. I've heard you in interviews say that you end up learning a lot from.
I absolutely do.
Classes. Yeah.
Yeah. For example, I'll give you a quick example. Going back about 3-4 years ago, I was teaching a composition workshop, and we were talking about movement. And I came up with this idea of where you lay some tracing paper over your image and you start diagramming it, where the movement go. And you maybe even think about circular movement, which I think is a really cool form of movement. And I tell you, that quadrupled my own sensitivity to movement and composition. Now there's a whole exercise in the book just about that. So yeah, it does really help me with my own work. But as I said to you before we started, you can as a teacher, you're so constantly thinking about, how do I put this stuff into a form that's digestible for everyone? I can overthink things sometimes, and that's, I guess, one of the side effects of teaching as much as I do, or teaching the way that I do. So, but it just
let's take a look at your work.
Yeah,
because I think your work so informs your approach to providing information to the students. So take us through.
Okay, so these paintings are in the order, more or less in the order that I did them. And I tend to work in series. So this is from a series I did quite a few years ago, a fog series. But I picked this painting in particular because I think it's very representational of what I love to do, which is that you might look at this, and my hope is that you're hit by an impression of glowing light first, and that you grasp that it's kind of a house second. In other words, with my work, I'm trying to play with the order of your perception. Like, what do you see first, and what do you see second, and what do you see third? So this is pretty abstracted, pretty simple. It's a fog, but taken out there by the lighthouse here. Anyway, so that's pretty representative of what I like to do in my painting.
I think this is really interesting because when I first saw it, I was like, oh, heavily Rothko influenced. And then the image slowly comes up. I mean, it's in a way, it's very cinematic, because your eye initially sees the color contrast, or the value contrast. And then all of a sudden, there's on that Rothko rectangle down at the bottom, there's a little bump up at the top. Oh, that could be a chimney. Yep. Oh, that could be, then you start seeing the windows on the side of the house. And also, interestingly, when I first saw it, the diagonals of the roof that's facing us, it's coming toward us. I was reading that as the stretchers on the canvas showing through. You know, I think it's a remarkable work.
Thank you.
I love it.
Great.
What do we got?
Yeah, that one's in the book. It's like one of the opening spread pages. Yeah.
Yeah. What do we got next?
Right. So
a little bit different here, Mitch. A little bit different.
Well, still a little fuzzy. I have a friend who's always accusing me of being a fuzzy painter. So this is from a series I did of the water, Snoqualmie Falls, the big waterfalls around here in Seattle. And again, you know, somebody might think it's a cloud, somebody might see it as water, but again, I'm playing with like the color event, and I think there's actually a movement event happening in this one, but those are the primary events. That it is water cascading or Cascadia down is really not, it's just a vehicle. Right. Like, I'm a very big believer, and for all representational painters, in fact, that, you know, what it is, like the waterfall or the car or the gas pump or whatever it is, that is just a vehicle. And we mustn't forget that.
I so agree with you. I so agree with you. And that's one of the examples that I would use of your how articulate you are in expressing these, because I become kind of tongue-tied about it. I'm always talking about the nominal subject is our portal into a study of light and dark and shape and value.
Exactly right. It's about the aesthetics. We're, if I can say this right, aestheticians, is that the word? Aestheticians? That's what we really do. And we get into trouble. The more we over-focus on the vehicle, like what the narrative is, the more trouble we get into, I think.
But yet, you also say it is important to know why you're painting a painting. Mm-hmm. And so there's almost always, no, that's untrue to say, but there's often an implied narrative in a painting.
Yes.
So
and sometimes you have some paintings coming up. I'll reference it. You have to straddle the two in a very careful way.
Okay. All right. Now that is a big painting. That's a 42 by.
That's pretty big for me. I don't usually get much bigger than that.
Okay. Okay. Next slide, please, Betty Sue.
You know, this is one from a series. Well, now on the show was called In Sunlight, and you know, on my website now, I think the series is renamed Sunlight and Snow. This is an example of the paintings that are very near and dear to my heart, because they deal with I'm really interested in getting things to glow, and how do I do that? And I think this one is a pretty successful example of it, because if you squint at it, you know, the value range is, if anything, it's half a point. It's half of 1 point out of 10. Very, very subtle value range. So, and everything that's happening is happening because of color contrast and temperature differences and saturated color. And I'm very intrigued by this model or approach to working with color, but obviously you can't do this with every subject, but I'm very intrigued by it.
And this is, if I recollect correctly, it is not a literal mountain that you're working from. This is a composite or a...
Actually, I mean, I did have a photographic reference that probably had a little more of those, you know, bare earth patches on the left side than on the right side. But I'm making a lot of changes to it. I mean, the photo was just typical blue and gray northwest mountaintop, but the whole coloration is completely my own.
Okay, and when we start talking about the book, maybe we circle back to this. You talk about how you will very often really skew the color in your photo references. So
yeah, absolutely, I do that. Sure.
Well, it's funny. One time when I was still in the Finding My Voice period, I took a workshop where the instructor was adamant about getting as true color and as sharp images, if you're working from photographs, as possible. And I had a terrible printer at that time, and I really liked that it freed me from slavishly attempting to copy something.
Yeah, if you looked at the photo reference that I'm looking at when I'm working, I radically alter it in Photoshop, and I run filters on it that chunk up the shapes and that distress it to get it to start suggesting to me what this idea looks like in paint, but really never just popping the photo out of the camera, hanging it up and saying, there we go. It's never, and it's something I actually don't do in my workshops. And I know it's much harder for students to do that. And it would be easier for me to just show them how to copy the color in the photograph, but I refuse to do it. I'm just not going to go that route. Good man,
Mitch. I'll support you in that. Next slide, please.
This was also from that mountain series. This one's, again, a little more hard edged, but again, very patterny, strong Notan component here. Pure design and shape and pattern is what this is about.
Right. Well, the thing that seems to me really crucial in this is how you are, to me, the culmination moment is the horizon, the lip of the snowfield against the sky, where you lose the edge. You're in such masterful control of that moment because there is still a slight color differentiation, though the value is identical.
Right, and if you can't tell it from this slide, but if you see the actual painting, the pinkish color above the horizon is fairly smooth and thin, and the paint just below it, that's snow, is a little thicker. So there's a little bit of a textural, tactile difference that's helping separate the two as well.
But your command of your narrative of this just being about how the snow patterns against the bare rock. I mean, that's all this is.
That's all it is.
A tone poem about that. It is, the design is so beautiful in this.
Thank you. Yeah, and I did two of these. One was in dusk and one was in bright daylight. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you find, let's see, Joe Doherty is asking, Mitch, have you studied fractals?
I know what they are, but no, I haven't studied them. No.
All right. Well, Joe apparently wants you to get right on that.
Okay.
But oh damn, I lost my train of thought on that. Anyway, gorgeous painting. Gorgeous painting. Next slide, please, Betty Sue.
Yeah, this one is part of that series, but done a few years later. Actually, that's the one right behind me here. And yeah, this one is, I really like this one, but I think it's a bit more representational, a little bit tighter than some of my other ones. But there's a lot of wonderful texture. You can make it out on the lower right a little bit. There's some very interesting texture there and a little bit of palette knife work. But the whole idea that I could almost like crop out a section from the middle third and it would be a little more abstract. But this one I feel is strong. It's just a little bit more rigid and tight and realistic, if you will, than some of my other pieces.
Right. So, Mitch, do you do lots of preliminaries to get the paintings to this stage?
Absolutely, in all kinds of forms. I mostly because I'm comfortable with digital tools like Photoshop and stuff. I will certainly take the original, like the original of this. Huge mountain. This is just a little tippy top that you're seeing here. So I do a lot of cropping. I do a lot of color alteration in Photoshop. I often do color studies, like little 4x4, 5x5, just knock them out, really crude stuff, just to see what color direction I want to go in. I'm a big believer in in like you said earlier, what is it you want to say here? Like, what's it about? I say this to my students all the time. What's it about? And they start saying, well, it's about a mountain. I say, no. Oh, it's about a cloud. No, it's about an aesthetic. And what is that aesthetic? So I do a lot of studies to just find which color, value, composition is going to make this statement best. I mean, sometimes that can be very compressed and happen rather quickly. There's a painting coming up that it happened like in an instant.
Right.
But sometimes I have to kind of work at it a little bit. The decision as to whether it's going to be in a square format, like one of the reasons this feels kind of calm and quiet is because it's circulating in a square format.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like a deep resonant sound there because of that. If it was vertical or horizontal, it might have a different tone to it.
It would. I think it would. I think you're absolutely right. One thing that in the interview that I watched that you had said was that that at times you will instruct your students to not when they're describing what the painting is about, they can't use nouns.
Yes, that's what I was just saying. That like, don't tell me it's about a cloud. Don't tell me it's about a mountain or it's about a train.
Right.
Tell me what the aesthetic is. And it's incredible. It's really hard for people to do that sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
It is partly about the cloud and the mountain and the train, but it's also about these other aesthetics. And I want to get them to start paying attention to that because face it, that's what we play with as painters.
Right.
We make these things with color and value and movement and composition and all those other delicious factors that we play with. That's how we make a painting. And we don't make a painting by copying a photograph.
Right. Exactly. That's making a picture. That's one thing that I do when I teach. I do try to impress upon people is that we're not making pictures. What we're doing is saying, come here, you gotta see this. This is you gotta see this. You know, we're storytellers, and it just depends whether it's a literal story or just an atmospheric story. You know, and this one, yes, I am more drawn to that previous slide, the tone poem one, than this, which is more descriptive.
Yeah, you know, another way of saying it is, am I telling you the whole story, or am I leaving a little something to the imagination?
Right. And are you a trustworthy narrator or the untrustworthy narrator? Both are legitimate ways of storytelling, you know. Absolutely. Next slide, please, Betty Sue. Yeah. Oh, this one kills me. This one kills me. I love this one.
Yeah. This one, I was at my school studio, and I was in there, I don't know, preparing for a class or something, taking photos, and it was starting to snow lightly, and I didn't pay attention to it. And then after about a half hour, it really was coming. I looked out the window, and I saw this like house covered, and I said, "Oh my God!" Anyway, so I took all these pictures, and I ran home, and I composed it. Literally that night, I had the stretcher bars out, and I was stretching a canvas for it. So this is an example of one where the vision or the idea hit me powerfully in an instant, and I knew right away what I wanted to do with it.
And this seems to me so informed by your awareness of the Notans and your consciousness of the big shapes. That there's this one, you know, it basically is the dark, the light, and one mid-tone.
Yes, like mid-tone, yeah.
But your consciousness of the way that the railings, the balustrades, echo the steps. It's such a smart painting.
Thank you.
And the lips of where the snow is hitting the cornices, all of that so the lines so relate to one another, and they're all different shapes and sizes. So I mean, I can understand why this would hit you immediately, because of how you have trained your eye and mind through doing the Notans and value studies.
You know, I think one of the reasons I've painted a lot of mountains and snow scenes is because snow really has a way of abstracting the world and turning it on its head. And that's very intriguing to me. Anything that's going to help me abstract the world. Like if you saw this shot in daylight, it's a hodgepodge of colors and pieces and parts. It's not as organized as this.
Well, it's stunning. Next slide, please, Betty Sue. This is part of a series that reminds me a little of Wayne Thiebaud. But talk to us about this.
Yeah, this is the most recent series. It's called Azure and Asphalt, if you want to go to my website and check out the rest of them. And this is the one I referred to earlier where I said, you know, like, okay, so it's representational. It's clearly some kind of urban thing, a river, a street, and, you know, some rooftops down there. But the bigger impression is this like shape and light. And so when I do these, once in an interview, they asked me, you know, about how you manage, this is an urban landscape, but it's so simple. And I said, well, I'm controlling the balance. I'm trying to put enough information or details in there so you can recognize that it's an urban landscape. You'll get that that's what it is, but not so many that it starts to tell a different story. I want you to be hit. Like I called this crossroads. I think in another painting like this, I might have called it triad because of the two fingers on either side and the little street at the bottom, because it's about that pattern and about the light. Mm-hmm. And so again, that's maybe 75% of what this is, 80%, and the other 20% is the little clues that say it's an urban landscape. Here, the urban landscape is just a vehicle for me to play with light and pattern.
Right. Such a good way that you encapsulate, that you describe that. Next slide, please, Betty Sue. Is that it for the? Okay, so there's one or two more.
One or two more, and that's it.
Okay.
And then this one, a couple of years back, I started playing with some pastels, and I really liked it. And this one is a pastel from this same series. And what I like about it, pastels, is that it allows me to work with broken color because of its nature in a way that oil does not. So it's kind of like it just, and sometimes not always, but I've had some really pleasing results in playing around with pastels.
And let's just broken color, and correct me if I have it wrong. Broken color is putting two pure colors right next to one another.
Well, the way I'm using the definition, it does mean two different colors juxtaposed, but it doesn't necessarily mean red and green that making a complement. To me, any kind of fractured, shard-like bit of color next to another color that isn't all blended and smooth, like right. You can kind of see it right in the middle at the very bottom. There are these little strokes of pale blue, a little stroke of, looks like a ruddy, dull reddish violet, a little gold, and they're just little strokes, and the sandy tooth of the paper makes those little bits sort of particulate and stand up. And that's what I mean by broken color. It isn't like like in the painting we saw before, that was kind of like a swath of pretty smooth blue-green.
Right.
Here, at a distance, it sort of comes together, but up close, it's made up of a few different patches of color that are similar in value and perhaps related in color in some ways. But there's little. I love when this happens in a painter's painting where you get lots of different colors, but those colors kind of come together and form a very unified, cohesive light.
Mm-hmm. Well, you are really a master of light, it seems to me. You have Thomas Kincaid beat all to hell.
Oh, good. Glad to hear it.
Next slide, please, Betty Sue.
I think she said that was the last one.
That's it for the, okay. So now let's talk a little about the book.
Okay.
I just, that tour through your work was just wonderful, though.
Thanks.
And
yeah, it's fun to look at it that way.
Oh, your snow paintings just kill me. They just kill me. Both that one of the rock face in the snow and the one of the house in the snow. Just spectacular work, Mitch. All right, so now tell us about the book.
Okay, well, there it is. This is my second book. Some of you may know my first book was Landscape Painting, Essential Concepts and Techniques for Plein Air and Studio Practice. That one came out in 2009, and it's done really well. It's been at like the top of the charts, so to speak, over at Amazon. At least that's what I'm using as my guide. And
I would use whatever chart has you at the top of it.
Yeah, and that one does. And I thought that I was not going to write a second book. And probably if you'd asked me, like, this came out in 2009, if you'd asked me in, say, 2011 or 12, ooh, could you write another book? I didn't really have the material. But of course, I was still teaching, and my teaching started to change. I started to get a lot more specific and practical in my classes. Like I backed off on doing demonstrations, which are can be helpful if you're showing a really specific way to do something. A demonstration is sort of necessary. But I started coming up with exercises to talk about, like, how do you organize color? How do you simplify shapes? How do you find a composition? Everything was exercise oriented. And that really started to kind of expand and improve my teaching, I think. So after quite a few years of that, I said, well, maybe this approach might have the makings of a book. And eventually it did. So I worked really hard, and I'm pretty proud of the fact that, although of course we're talking about simplification and color and composition, those are the big three with landscape painting in any book, but that the topics that I'm covering, that they're different than the first book. And so, if you had them both, you would get something different from each one of them.
Well, one of the things that I really love about this book is that you articulate some things that I absolutely believe, but I had found very hard to put into words. You use something called the 80-20 rule. Talk about that a little.
Okay, so if you can visualize the paintings we had just seen, one of the previous paintings, like the urban landscape, the one where I was saying, oh, this is about like 80% about the light and the pattern. Yeah, that one, or the one before. Yeah, that one. That's 80% about the pattern and the light, and 20% about the detail. And I did that for very specific reasons. But generally speaking, when especially painters who are new to landscape, start painting the landscape, this too, Charlie, that there's this kind of obsession with the detail, because the detail is what they understand. But seeing the abstract underlying structure, much harder to see and much harder to understand. So the 80-20 rule is just sort of a way of saying that even if you're not painting obviously a sort of an ethereal atmospheric scene like this, that even in a clear, crisp daylight scene, in terms of painting, in terms of what you have to think through as a painter, you want to most of our attention, or the viewer's attention, you're guiding our attention, should be on the main dominant shapes. And then if there are details, yes, to be sure there are details. They can be really helpful, but they're only about 20%. Now, of course, that 80-20 rule can be 85-15 or 90-10, but the bottom line being that you always want to focus on the big dominant shapes. And what people do at the start of their journey is they over focus on drawing every little blade of grass and every little leaf and every little detail. And those details can be there, but they have to be assigned to a really solid foundation first. And that's really what I teach, the foundation stuff. I don't teach the detail stuff. You can put the details in if you want, but it's the foundation, because the foundation is that abstract underpinning that really makes a painting really good.
Yeah. I interrupted you there. I'm sorry. I just was so impressed when I read that. So I was like, yes, that's it. That's it. So if there's one more thing I can guide you to be sure to discuss. I mean, I'm going to turn it back to you to be talking about the book, but
Yeah.
do talk about the Notans a little.
Okay.
That's such
yeah, I think there's a shot of the spread from the book. Yeah, there it is. There's a whole chapter on Notan, which I think is one of the coolest things about the book. I couldn't very well write a second book and not have a section on Notan in it after teaching all these Notan workshops for years. So there's a lot I could say about the Notan. The thing I'll say is, because it's a pretty hot topic, you could find lots of little videos on it online from me and others. I treat, but let me just interrupt and say, you'll probably mention my website at the end, but there's a really cool 13-minute video on my website. Just do a search on Notan, and that really explains it very well. And then, of course, this chapter of my book does as well. But the big thing that I teach with Notan is that I don't treat it so much as a value study, which is what everybody thinks it is. Oh yeah, black and white, light and dark, light and shadow. And it's like, well, yeah, it's that a little bit. But you can even see in this slide here that those two black and white versions at the top of the right page, they don't really look like that Albert Bierstadt painting on the left page. I mean, in terms of their values, what they do is they capture the essential underlying structure. And so does Notan have something to do with values? Well, yeah. I mean, of course, you're using black, you're using white, they're values. And do some of the values, like do the whites in a Notan often correspond to light, and do the darks often correspond to shadow? They do, but not always. And it's the not always part that we have to address. So in the not always circumstance, where there are many values, the black and white, or as you can see in the lower right here, the black, white, and a mid-gray, can't fully describe the value structure of a painting. So what we do use it for is to describe the shape structure. I call Notan, as I see it, it's a compositional study. It has a little bit to do with value, but it's primarily about grabbing onto shapes, understanding the blocks, the building blocks that make up the composition. And that's the whole lens through which I discuss it in this chapter in the book.
Well, composition, to me, it's very interesting because I get credited with having really good compositional sense. And I think it's because I worked as a album cover designer and tour poster maker, graphic designer for years, and also had very rigorous graphic design training in college. So I don't think about it, and it's very hard for me to articulate it. You spend a lot of time in this book talking about composition.
I do.
And how do you articulate what makes a good composition? How do you articulate that to people?
Well, I break it down into chunks, I guess. I mean, this book dealt with a couple of things. One was, the picture window. I think sometimes people underestimate just how much, like how you're going to compose, how you're going to frame that thing, because that's where you eliminate all the excess stuff and where you bring your focus. There's a tremendous amount of, I say it's the first act of composition is that picture window. But in the long chapter on composition, we talk about variation, which I call the king, not a rule, but sort of the really main event in composition. And that's variation of size, of values, of color, and the intervals in between shapes. And so it's sort of like a 6 or 12 cylinder engine. We want every cylinder firing to create the most variation in every possible way. So we talk a lot about variation, and we talk about movement. This is going back to that little anecdote I told you earlier about, like, when I did movement in my workshop, it was sort of like opened it up for me as well. So there's a section on movement, including an exercise there on how you can start to diagram or track movement in your source image. And then I talk about something that I feel is almost kind of unique to landscape, which is dealing with the negative spaces, right? So in landscape, we all know negative spaces. Usually there's the positive space and then the air and the space behind it or in between. It's the donut hole. That's the negative space. And that is the negative space. But in landscape, the biggest piece of negative space, if you will, is the sky, right? Another one we have is like big fields or streets. Now, a field and a street is not negative in the sense that it's empty space. It's real space, but because they're usually, the skies, the fields, and the streets are often just kind of flat, solid patches of color, I treat them like negative space. And I talk about how you can activate the negative space, all the things we can do in the sky and in the street and in the fields, the little visual cues that we give to make sure that those areas are not just flat backdrops, but that they're a fully integrated part of the composition. Integration being the key word here. So I guess those three things are not all there is about composition, but those are certainly the ones that I focus on in the book. So yeah, so how do I teach it? I break it down and I give them exercises that allows them to focus on each aspect of it.
And that seems fundamental to part of your teaching protocol as well, which is you say that you're trying to get the students to ask the right questions.
Yep. Yeah, especially with composition.
And if one is just thinking of composition as a totality, it's hard to know what questions to ask. But what you were just saying, by breaking it down into these component parts, you can then ask, how have I activated this large component of the painting, or do I wish to activate it? Okay.
And with composition, it's particularly interesting that more so than say color or drawing or something, that when we have a good composition in front of us and a not so good composition, and you ask 15 people, like 14 of them are going to all agree that this one is better. We have an innate sensibility that allows us to tell a good composition from a poor composition, or a better one from a worse one. And but we don't pay attention to it unless we ask the question. So you ask the right questions, you'll get answers. It's, what we do is we teach people how to make inquiries. But a lot of the time, people don't know what questions to ask, and we're just kind of training them to ask the right questions.
Well, I think it's brilliant. Any last things you want to leave us with?
No, I just would say thanks for having me on, and also point out to the listeners that, you got it down at the bottom of the screen, that at my website, I do have a really active blog. There's about 85 full-length articles there dealing with all this stuff that we've been talking about. A handful of them I call studio visits. So if you want to see some more of my work where I talk about it in detail, and how I did it, like we did today, that's all there, and you can subscribe or not, but you can go there, and it's just all free. And there's also my first book too, if people don't know about that one. There's that one too, and I think both make a handy pair.
Excellent. Well, I'm not. I may be heresy, but I'm not familiar with the first book. I'm only familiar with this one, and this one absolutely knocked me out. I mean, and we haven't even delved into all your discussion of color. But ladies and gentlemen, look at how just the images he chooses to use as examples in this book. They're all fantastic contemporary paintings too. So it's an amazing book. I really can't. I'm so impressed with it. And
thanks.
I so thank you for joining us today. And
I thank you for having me.
You take good care, and everybody out there in internet land, you take good care too. And thank you, Betty Sue, for taking care of us. We'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.